Oak Ridge Academy was more of a sanctuary for the untouchable than a school. Its wrought iron gates and marble hallways radiated generational wealth, a place where a student's value was measured by bank balances rather than intellect. Here, the elite were groomed to rule, leaving little room for anyone who didn't fit the mold. The air always smelled of expensive cologne and old money, a constant reminder to those who entered that they were part of something exclusive. Leo sat in the back of the classroom, a ghost in a sea of tailored suits. His uniform was faded, the fabric thinned at the elbows from years of wear. To his peers, he was an invisible scholarship case, a background character in their stories of luxury. To Leo, every second was a calculation. Every minute in class was time stolen from the 2 jobs he worked to pay for his mother's mounting medical bills. She was his only motivation, the reason he endured the biting cold of early mornings and the crushing exhaustion that lived deep in his bones. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Sterling, a woman whose heart was as cold as the spectacles perched on her nose. She took immense pride in teaching the elite and viewed scholarship students like Leo as stains on the school's reputation. To her, they were an inconvenience to the purity of the institution, a charity project she had no interest in supporting. She believed that intelligence was a trait of the wealthy, and those without means were simply taking up space. The tension in the room spiked when Mrs. Sterling began returning the results of the advanced calculus midterms. She glided between desks, dropping papers with practiced disdain. When she reached Leo, she didn't drop the paper. She held it with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. The grade at the top was a perfect 100%, circled in bold red ink. The classroom went silent as the high achievers stared in disbelief. Mrs. Sterling's voice dripped with skepticism as she demanded to know who he had stolen the answers from, claiming someone of his background couldn't possibly understand such complex work. Leo insisted he had simply solved them, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. But his honesty only fueled the fire. Julian, the arrogant class president, led the room in a wave of snickering. He joked that Leo probably found the answer key while mopping floors, and the laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. Mrs. Sterling didn't stop the mockery. Instead, she pointed at Leo's scuffed shoes and his cheap, spiral-bound notebook. She told him he was wasting a seat that a paying student deserved, and that his presence was an insult to the academy. To prove he was a fraud, she turned to the chalkboard and wrote a series of unsolved theoretical equations. It was a labyrinth of symbols that had baffled academics for years. She gave him a week to solve it, or face expulsion for academic dishonesty, claiming she would not have her classroom turned into a playground for frauds. Leo remained silent, his photographic memory already cataloging every stroke of the chalk. He endured the cold glares and Julian's sneers, his face a mask of calm that hid the brilliant mind whirling beneath the surface. He didn't defend himself. He simply waited for the day to end. On later that night, the prestige of Oak Ridge was replaced by the sterile glass of a local tech hub. Dressed in a janitor's jumpsuit, Leo pushed a heavy mop across the polished floors. He wasn't there to study, but to survive. As he passed a conference room, he saw a whiteboard covered in a half-finished schematic for a high-end propulsion system. Professional engineers had been stuck on it for weeks, their notations a mess of dead ends. Leo paused, setting his mop aside. He picked up a marker, and his hand moved with terrifying precision. He corrected the variables and bridged the logic gaps in seconds. To the world, he was just a boy in a jumpsuit, but here, he was the master of a universe they couldn't see. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And the weight of his secret genius felt heavier than the mop he carried, yet it was the only thing that kept him going through the long, dark hours. The next morning, Mrs. Sterling walked into her classroom, ready to finalize Leo's expulsion and restore the purity of her class. But as she looked at the chalkboard, her breath caught in her throat. The board was covered in perfect, breathtaking notations, a solution that defied everything she knew about mathematics. The impossible problem had been solved with an elegance that was undeniably brilliant. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the dust from the ledge, realizing that the student she had mocked was operating on a level she could never hope to attain. The classroom, once her fortress of superiority, now felt like a prison of her own ignorance. The Leo was nowhere to be found, leaving behind only the evidence of a genius she had tried so hard to break. Mrs. Sterling stood paralyzed before the chalkboard, her fingers clutching a silk handkerchief, as if it were a shield against the impossible. The notations weren't just correct. They possessed a rhythmic beauty, a sequence of logic that bypassed conventional academic thought. Her mind raced to find an explanation that didn't involve the boy in the faded uniform. Surely it was Julian, she told herself, desperate to preserve her worldview. Julian was the scion of a banking dynasty, a boy groomed for greatness. She convinced herself that Julian had spent the night in a feverish burst of inspiration, finally proving the worth of his lineage. When the classroom filled, she praised Julian for his unseen efforts, and the boy, sensing an opportunity for unearned glory, simply smirked and allowed the lie to take root. Leo, seated at the back of the room, watched the charade with a hollow expression, his silence mistaken for defeat. The air at Oak Ridge Academy grew thick with anticipation as the global mathematics decathlon approached. This wasn't just a contest. It was an arena where the wealthy cemented their future, with Ivy League scouts and a cash prize waiting at the finish line. For Leo, that prize was a lifeline. His mother's condition had worsened, and the stack of mounting medical bills on their kitchen table had grown into a mountain he couldn't climb. He approached Mrs. Sterling after class, his voice a low plea, asking to join the school's competitive team. Her response was a cold, high-pitched laugh. She told him that Oak Ridge had a brand to maintain, and that a charity case had no place on a stage of that caliber. Instead, she handed him a heavy canvas bag, appointing him the team's equipment boy. He would carry their calculators and notebooks, a servant to the peers who weren't even qualified to check his work. In the quiet of the school's library, Leo found a moment of respite. The principal happened upon him, watching as Leo's eyes scanned a dense volume on quantum mechanics at a speed that seemed impossible. When the principal questioned his interest, Leo offered a single, devastatingly elegant critique of the author's primary theorem. It was a glimpse of the sun through a crack in a door, leaving the principal stunned and questioning the rigid hierarchy of his own institution. Yet, the status quo was a powerful tide. When Leo was still just a boy with scuffed shoes and a hidden life. Julian, however, was not blinded by Sterling's flattery. He had seen the way Leo looked at complex problems, a look of recognition rather than confusion. Fear began to rot Julian's confidence. Late one evening, while Leo was finishing his shift at the tech hub, Julian broke into Leo's locker. He found it, a research journal filled with months of groundbreaking derivations. It was Leo's soul on paper. Julian didn't just want to win. He wanted to erase his competition. He dragged the journal to the school's basement furnace room. Leo arrived as the orange glow danced on Julian's malicious grin. The boy tossed the book into the roaring flames. Leo watched the paper turn to ash, months of desperate work vanishing into smoke. Mrs. Sterling appeared in the doorway, her presence suggesting she had authorized the cleanup. She whispered that he should learn his place before his ambition destroyed him. Leo stood in the darkness long after they left, the smell of burnt paper clinging to his skin. But then, a strange calm washed over him. He closed his eyes and saw the pages, every line, every variable. His mind was a vault, and the paper had only been a mirror. He didn't need the journal because he was the journal. He possessed a photographic memory that no fire could touch. The morning of the departure for the decathlon was chaotic. The school's bus waited at the curb, but the atmosphere was frantic. Julian, the supposed star, had suddenly fallen ill, his face pale with the expectations he couldn't meet. As Mrs. Sterling panicked, the principal approached with a document. He announced that an anonymous donor from a major tech hub had registered a final candidate for the Oak Ridge team, a candidate whose entry had been processed weeks ago. Mrs. Sterling's eyes widened in horror as the principal looked directly at the boy holding the equipment bags, telling him it was time to put them down and step onto the bus. The air in the grand auditorium was thick with the weight of expectation. On the illuminated stage, the remaining members of the Oak Ridge team looked like statues of panic. Without Julian to lead them, they were drowning in the advanced theoretical physics round. The questions on the large screens were labyrinths of logic that left the elite students stuttering. Mrs. Sterling sat in the front row, her knuckles white. Her reputation was tied to this victory, and it was slipping through her fingers. "Step forward, Leo," the principal's voice cut through the murmurs. Leo didn't hesitate. He walked down the center aisle, his worn-out shoes making a rhythmic tapping sound against the marble. He wore his faded blazer, the elbows thin. As he climbed the stairs, the audience erupted into whispers. To them, he looked like a stagehand who had lost his way. Mrs. Sterling stood up, her face a mask of fury. "This is an outrage!" she hissed, loud enough for the first rouse to hear. She rushed toward the stage, attempting to block Leo's path. "He is not part of this team. He is a common laborer. He will embarrass this institution." She turned to the panel of judges. "I demand he be removed for the sake of the Academy's prestige." The head judge, a Nobel laureate with eyes like flint, looked from the frantic teacher to the steady boy. "The registration is valid, madam. The competition will proceed." Leo ignored her. He took his place at the podium, his hands resting on metal. The final problem flashed on the screen. A notorious, unsolved equation regarding multidimensional entropy. The room went silent. The other competitors backed away, defeated. A 60-second timer started its countdown. Leo didn't use a calculator. He stared at the numbers, and the fire that had consumed his journal roared back to life as light. He saw the variables as living things, shifting into place. With 50 seconds left, he picked up the stylus. His hand moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, a blur of motion. He bypassed 3 steps of derivation, creating a shortcut through the calculus that none of the judges had ever seen. At the 10-second mark, he tapped the final period. And the screen processed the data, and then a green light illuminated the hall. "Correct!" the voice boomed. The auditorium exploded. People stood in shock, cheering at the boy who had just rewritten a law of physics in less than a minute. In the chaos, a tall man in a bespoke suit walked onto the stage. It was the CEO of the tech hub. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "For months, I watched this young man solve problems my engineers couldn't touch while he was supposed to be emptying trash cans," the CEO announced. "I am the anonymous donor who put him here. Genius doesn't care about your shoes." The board of directors, alerted by the principal, moved in. The evidence of Mrs. Sterling's bias, the falsified reports, and the systematic bullying had been brought to light by security footage. As the press swarmed, Mrs. Sterling was escorted from the auditorium, her career in ruins. Leo stood with the $100,000 prize check. It meant his mother's surgery and a future without fear. As he prepared to leave, he found Mrs. Sterling standing in the shadow of the hallway, a broken woman. "How?" she whispered. "How could you be so much better than them?" Leo paused, looking at his shoes. "You were too busy looking at my feet to notice I was miles ahead of you," he said. He walked out of the academy for the last time, leaving the prestige behind to walk into a future he had built with his mind.